Do you ever find yourself sitting in front of a movie and then noticing something that's distracting because it just doesn't follow? How's it? This is Chop, Screenplay Prep. Don't be the writer that's the cause of those little things that just don't add up in a movie. Now, it can be, of course, that the writing isn't at fault and it's the director or the editor that decides in production to change something, swap something around, such that either it's the continuity or something is skipped. And this is often done when budget or time become an issue where they need to shorten the movie for one reason or another. So for the love of the craft of screenwriting, I implore you as a screenwriter to not skip on the little details. Here's an example of what I mean. I was in the cinema the other day and saw a movie that is currently available called Great White. It's another one of the typical shark movies where beautiful couples are stuck in the water on a tour or something and the sharks come. We won't get into the merits of the movie. Is it worth seeing? Is it not? But what I want to pick up on is a particular scene that really took me out of the movie. It put me into the seat of the critic, which meant that whilst I was then hung up on this detail, I wasn't involved emotionally and continuing with the action. So the scenario is the wide open ocean and a life raft with 5 characters in it. The female, Michelle, is paddling with the oar and they're taking turns, and her hands are getting rather red raw. And her husband turns to her and says, "Let me see your hands." So Joe, being chivalrous to his wife, decides to bind her right hand. And it makes sense that if she's been using both hands on the oar, that the left also would need attention. But we don't see that happen. So when we do see in an ensuing shot that her left hand has also been bound, it just jars. You think, hang on, well, we were cheated there. We didn't see that happen. And it's magically appeared. It just seems like something that was for the benefit of the cut. It just comes across as cutting corners and being lazy, and then I'm losing the thread of the story because I'm sitting in the cinema chair moaning about this to myself in my head, and I'm lost. The filmmakers have lost me. Okay, sure, they've regained my attention because, ultimately it's a relatively thrilling movie, but that shouldn't happen at all. You should not present a moment where you lose your audience. Now, it could be, of course, that this wasn't the scriptwriter's fault. I hear you cry. However, my point is, don't give the filmmakers an excuse. If this was to be brought up in an interview, let's say, they could always blame the script because the script didn't talk about the binding of the other hand. Therefore, when I said earlier, don't skip things, what I mean to say, when you're writing this particular scene, make sure to include, and then he binds the left hand. If the filmmakers choose not to show in the edit or film the other hand being bound, then, well, that's their problem. But you, as a screenwriter, have done your job. Just don't give them an excuse to skip things, because the audience will pick up on it. This reminds me of a subject that a client once brought up with me about a character in his house. So let's say Bob's in Bob's house, and he needs to get in his car and drive over to his friend Joe's house. So you'd have an interior living room, Bob's house. Bob picks up his keys, walks out the room and out the front door. Exterior house, Bob gets in his car. Now, how far do you need to go in paving that journey? So the question the client specifically asked was, do I need to show him in the car and then doing the journey and then arriving, etc., etc.? Well, if you're going to end up with a scene where Bob is now in Joe's house, it's obvious he would have had to have got in a car or something, maybe got on a bike. Is it important that the audience know whether it was a car or a bike? Potentially not. But if you want a degree of clarity, all you need to do is do exterior Bob's house, Bob gets in his car. You don't even need to worry about whether it started up. You don't need to see him necessarily reverse down the driveway. If the director wants to film him doing that, that is fine, but the script does not need to go that far. So once you've got Bob in his car, you can jump to an interior Joe's house and have Joe answering the door. The camera would be on the inside, and there would be Bob standing at that open door and would walk in. You don't need to complete that journey in between, unless, of course, there's some story element that requires it, that he sees something along the way, or you're setting the scene as to where Joe's house is. Maybe it's near the Hollywood sign, whatever it is, assuming it's important to the story. If it's not relevant where Joe's house is, then you don't need to worry so much about the exteriors and the journey leading up to it. So that would be an example where you wouldn't be skipping something that's necessary. So with the scene I've just laid out between Bob and Joe, an example of skipping something there would be to show Bob interior Bob's house, to then jump interior Joe's house. It could be confusing as to whether Bob just walked to a different room and Joe's in that room. You want to show Bob leaving his house and ideally entering that front door of Joe's house. But it could also be enough to have him seen getting in his car on the exterior of Bob's house, to then showing him sitting down onto a couch in Joe's living room. That car would have had to have driven somewhere, and he obviously would have had to have got out of the car to be able to be sitting down on this couch. So the audience can pick up the pieces and fill in the gaps to a point. But just don't be overly doing it. At the same time, don't be lazy and skip things that might be relevant. And ultimately, you know the difference when you read it back and think of your screenplay from an audience perspective. And would an audience member be sitting there thinking, well, hang on, the right one was done, but what about the left one? So keep in mind also with the notion of skipping things is don't assume that the director or the reader ultimately would be able to fill in the gaps with certain things. Never write in your script the words as before or etc., etc. You've got to furnish each scene and be explicit and clear. And don't fall victim to the critics. I hope that gives you a good perspective on potential negative aspects of screenwriting and prevents you from making those mistakes yourself. See you in the next video.